Well, welcome everybody to today's conversation. We're glad that you joined us today. I'm Sean, one of the ministry consultants here at the Unstuck Group, and I'm also your host for this conversation. Many multi-site churches are struggling with the negative outcomes of a multi-site model that they currently have, and they're wondering, especially on this side of the pandemic, should we continue or should we consider un-multi-siting? But really, we've seen, when done correctly, multi-site can be an extremely effective tool for carrying out the mission of the church, but not all multi-site strategies are created equal. So that's why we're here today for this conversation. Before we dive into that, I want to introduce you to our panelists. Many of you probably know them, but some may not. So joining us today for today's conversation is Tony Morgan. Tony's the founder and lead strategist here at the Unstuck Group. We started in 2009. And have served a little over 500 churches now throughout the United States, Canada, and several other countries a part of the world. And specifically with the multi-site conversation, Tony, I'm not trying to date you, but you've been kind of in the multi-site world, either pastoring in a church or helping churches through the Unstuck Group for 20 plus years. Is that right?
That's right. So first started studying multi-site way back at the beginning when the very first churches were starting to engage with that strategy, and then was a part of a church, South Carolina, New Spring Church, helped them launch their first locations in different parts of South Carolina. And Sean, since we started the Unstuck Group, it's been over 100 now multi-site churches that we've had the opportunity to serve. Awesome. So a lot of work around multi-site strategy.
Yeah, that's great. And of course, the other panelist today joining us is Amy Anderson. And Amy serves now as the director of consulting here at the Unstuck Group since about 2016. And during that time, she's helped over 150 churches on site, helping them design ministry strategy, staffing, and multi-site strategies also that just aligns and fuels their mission. And Amy, prior to being at the Unstuck Group, you were part of a great church in the Twin Cities area, Eagle Brook Church, where I know when you started, you were much smaller and had less campuses than when you transitioned here. So tell us a little just quickly about that, your multi-site journey there.
Yeah, we weren't necessarily a small church. We were about 1,800 people, but one location. And man, crazy ride going from 1 to 2 to 3 and eventually up to 6 campuses over my 13 years there. Learned a lot. We didn't know a lot about multi-site back then, which it's better now, right, Tony? We know some predictable outcomes that come from learning what churches have tried over the past couple of decades.
Yeah, that's great. And those kinds of outcomes, that's what we're going to dig into today in today's conversation. And we actually have a goal for you, for all of you tuning in today through today's conversation. Our goal is that you'll commit today to fixing your multi-site strategy this year, this calendar year, or to un-multi-siting. So that's our goal for you. Either this year, you're going to fix whatever feels broken about your multi-site strategy, or you're going to choose to un-multi-site. So let me just give you a sense of kind of where we're headed over the next 45 minutes or so, and give you a little insight. So kind of a secret behind the curtain here. Amy, Tony, and I, we're actually not here with you live today. We've pre-recorded this conversation because Amy is getting some well-deserved time off at the day of our webinar. So we wanted to get her insight in this conversation. So we pre-recorded this video, but here's the key. Myself and Tony will be live at the end of this content to answer your questions. So as we go through kind of each aspect of this conversation today, I want you to know we're going to be here live to answer those questions. In fact, we're probably in the Q&A room right now chatting with you. So here's where we're going. We're going to talk about 3 things specifically: the predictable outcomes of some of the most well-known multi-site models. We're going to talk about how to fix a broken multi-site strategy. And then we're going to talk about how to decide when it's time to un-multi-site. And some of you may be considering that today. So last few things before we jump into the conversation. Feel free to talk in chat, have conversations there, interact with each other. But if you have specific questions for our team, submit those using the Q&A feature that you see there in Zoom. And Jordan or maybe Tony or myself will be responding in real time. As well as just helping select some of those questions that we're going to cover in the live Q&A at the end of the event. And then if you hear some insight today, something that's helpful for you, something that you'd like to share with others on social media, we'd love it if you'd use the hashtag #UnstuckChurch. So hashtag #UnstuckChurch on social media, and that will allow us to kind of all engage the conversation there today. Okay, so let's dive into the first topic. It may not be popular, but I really think it's true. There are some right ways and some wrong ways to do multi-sites, and I'll include in that mergers. And this has become clearer than ever over the last few years. We've seen some well-known churches that have opted to un-multisite. Some even have had leadership implosions. Some find themselves shutting down campuses that never became self-sustaining or that ended up empty during the pandemic. But on the other side of that, there are also churches that even through the past 2 years of the pandemic, they've continued to open new locations and are reaching hundreds, sometimes thousands of new people with the gospel. So we're going to get into this conversation of predictable outcomes and some common strategies here. So Tony, let me start with you. Would you get us started just sharing this multi-site spectrums chart that we use when we work with churches and how specifically we use it?
This is what the chart looks like, and you'll see it really provides an overview of all the core ministries of the church. And when we're on site working through multi-site strategy, we're helping the church identify, do we want to be more identical or more independent at all of our locations? And with that, let me show you a couple examples from churches we've served. This first church, you can see almost everything landed on the identical side with the exception of care and local outreach. And by the way, if churches do lean at all towards independence, those are a couple of the areas, especially local outreach, because it's not uncommon for churches to identify, the needs really are different in the different communities where our campuses are located. But this church, this is actually from a conversation I had with them about 5 or 6 years ago. This church has continued to grow. They've continued to add more locations. They're up to 6 locations now, all very good sized locations. And it's an example that by choosing to be identical in each of these core ministry areas, they have momentum at all their locations and they're experiencing health. Here's a second one, though. This looks very different, doesn't it? And you can see this church landed primarily on the independent side. And unfortunately, the outcome here, again, it's pretty predictable because we've seen this happen with a number of churches that have introduced a lot of independence at all of their campuses. This church at one time had 5 locations. They're now down to 3 because 2 of those locations, I can't remember, I think one of them became an independent church. Another location, they just shut down. But needless to say, they were not getting traction on their ministry model because what we see, of course, is when churches lean towards independence, it just adds complexity throughout the ministry. It requires typically more staffing. It's in a more expensive model. There's just confusion that's created rather than the efficiencies and the synergy that you hope to see through a multi-site model. And as a result of that, in the end, it's often leading to decline in attendance and connection to the churches. And that's obviously the last thing we want to see through any ministry strategies that we're engaging. There's a bit of a redemption story, though, around this particular church because they decided after shutting down 2 of their locations to shift and move more towards independence in all of these areas. And we just got a note from the pastor just a few months ago, and he shared that for the first time in a long time, they're starting to see momentum again. And so it's just a good example, Sean, getting to the topic of predictable outcomes, depending on how churches lean around their ministry strategies, more identical or more independent, we do see some predictable outcomes.
Yeah. So Amy, let's kind of zero in on 2 of these and just talk specifically about the predictable outcomes that you see with different choices.
So what Tony was basically alluding to, I think, is that when we talk about predictable outcomes, either you're going to be a healthy multi-site church or you're going to not be a healthy multi-site church, which means you might go independent with your campuses overall, more of a church planting thing. And that's a little bit about what we're alluding to. So what I see the biggest predictor for tipping a church towards really that healthy multi-site side, or more towards the independent, eventually becoming their own church side, is the area of teaching. When we have a highly identical side, that's one teacher, one teaching team, I should say, via video, bringing that teaching to a church. And so that church gets one communication team, they're getting one message. They know they're part of this bigger community. They're all under one vision for the church. And we just see that teaching team via video is part of the success factor that predicts a healthy multi-site. When we get onto the independent side of teaching, whether we release it all, like teach whatever you want, whatever series, or even if you say, here's what we all should be teaching about, and we're teaching about relatively the same things. When we see independence there, what we find is that the attenders really start to follow their leader. That person who's communicating God's word to them, that is the person that has influence in their life. And that person over time may start to have a slightly different vision than the lead pastor or the overarching church has. And both teacher and congregation, they start to think about their church, not necessarily the entirety of the church, because they really don't even have visibility to the lead pastor at that point. And so we just see it start to move more independent. And we find multi-site churches that are living highly on this independent side eventually do not stay part of a larger multi-site church. They actually become a more independent campus. You could actually talk about worship arts in that same way. Highly identical reinforces we're one church in multiple locations. You can go to our church in any of these various towns or cities. You're going to experience our church. When we release autonomy and go more into an independent feel, churches often do this for great reasons, by the way. Could be that community feels very different than the community where the sending church came from. Could be based on maybe a staff member who just has a different bent or a different way that they prefer to do music. But just know when you do that, it starts to separate your churches from feeling like one church, multiple locations. And again, lends itself more towards a church planting mentality. And then the last one I'd highlight is actually the third one on the chart, which is just a discipleship pathway. When we have one pathway and we're all marching towards those same goals as it relates to how people are going to take their next steps in becoming more like Jesus, we have lots of efficiencies, same language, we measure the same things. When we go autonomous, that's where campus pastors really start to create their own ministry strategies. Communication becomes a little bit more complicated. And again, that's really more the behavior of a church plant to take a look at their people and come up with their own discipleship pathway than to go one church, multiple locations.
Amy, actually, I have a follow-up question for you.
Sure.
Now that I see you talking about this, we would never recommend this, but if a church said, we're going to make everything identical except for the teaching, and it's going to be very independent, that's one choice. The other choice is the teaching is identical. It's the same message at every location, but everything else is independent. Which of those two would you choose for that church to experience success?
I honestly, Tony, I wouldn't choose either. And let me say why. There is not a lot of negotiation on that chart we just showed you, even though it looks like there is. Really, one side of the chart, the left side of the chart, says we're going to be one church, multiple locations, and we're going to embrace the strategies, the proven strategies over 20 years that shows that that's a healthy outcome. Or we're going to embrace the right side where it's going to be independent. And we may start together, but it's for the sole purpose of launching those into independent churches. Because here's why. We love to skate the middle. We love to grab a little over here and a little over there. But that middle, it's not hot, it's not cold, it's not identical, it's not independent, it is lukewarm. And it's actually, my opinion, getting passionate, it's the worst option because we think we're going to get the best worlds. But what we end up doing is bleeding financially. We start to decline, the wheels start to fall off. And so I would just say, pick a side, be hot or cold, whichever one you think is hot or cold, and work the proven strategies that produce a healthy church.
That's good.
Tony, there's one other really key leadership decision that has a definite predictable outcome to it. And it comes up all the time with multi-site churches. and that's how we select campus pastors. So what would you say about that?
Yeah, so filling the campus pastor role obviously is critical. And we recommend that and this is based on experience of where we've seen success, that you look for somebody, very gifted leader, obviously, but it's somebody who really believes in the overall DNA of who you are as a church. And by the way, not just the mission and vision of the church, but all the strategies that you're engaging as a church. So going back to our last conversation, it's somebody, whatever strategies you decide to use in all of those key areas, you want your campus pastor to be fully bought in and to be able to champion how you engage, how you actually engage the mission that God's called you to. This person also, it's just in them to get ministry done through other people. And so you'll notice these are the people that they raise up other leaders, they build volunteer teams, and it's almost like they're fulfilled not by doing it themselves, but by helping other people accomplish the mission that God's given the church. This is somebody who's very driven. They recognize the hard work it takes not only to launch a new campus, but also to continue to help that campus thrive. But here's maybe the key thing related to all of this is this person has to be willing to be a second chair leader. In other words, they need to be willing to come under another leader's mission, vision, values, ministry philosophy, and not to try to shape that themselves. And when someone isn't able to do that, it's still a gifted leader, but when they feel like they have to shape their own mission, vision, values, strategies, it's an indication really that they're probably more wired to be a senior pastor, a student pastor, a church planter, and they're probably not going to find success as a campus pastor. And the unfortunate thing is many times churches hire that type of person to be the campus pastor. And all it does is I think it leads to frustration for the leader because they're not able to use their wiring and their gifting because they feel constrained in that role. And then that creates challenge for everybody else, especially for the senior pastor, because they're feeling the tension as if that person's always kind of pulling in a different direction because they're in a leadership position that's not a good fit for their wiring. So because this is such a critical issue in our multi-site process that we use at the Unstuck Group, we have a profile of a campus pastor, and there's an exercise that we go through that includes, Amy, it's 10 different success factors. Yeah, so that you can look at prospective campus pastor candidates to make sure you're identifying the right person to be in this role.
It's a lukewarm thing you just talked about, Tony.
That's right.
I want the central support. I want the strategies to come over that we can implement at our campus. Love the efficiency of that. But I would really like to just take us a little bit this way or that way. And I would really like to teach. And that's, again, they're good people, but that's where the splintering begins in a multi-site organization.
That's right.
Well, before we move on to the next section, for everybody who's tuned in today, just want to encourage you to take just a moment and reflect. Based on what we've shared so far today, and from our experience with serving more than 100 multi-site churches, what do you think the predictable outcome is of your current multi-site model? Is that where you're hoping to end up? And we're going to give you some space to just kind of make some notes in your conversation guide that you have there. So if you can print that off or just type on your PDF online, but just reflect just with a few ideas of your predictable outcomes for your current model. So moving into our next conversation, churches who are multi-stuck, meaning they're stuck in multiple locations, they often get to feel overwhelmed because they know something's broken, but they're really not sure how to fix it. And we found there are several key areas that churches need to kind of assess to begin building a way forward. Amy, we use, when we work with a church, a specific assessment chart called Multisite Checkpoints. Would you be willing to just kind of share that and talk us through that today?
Yeah, now this part of the webinar is about how to fix your multi-site model. And whenever we engage with the church, our process always starts with perspective. So in other words, before we start planning and dreaming for the future, we recognize it's important to understand our starting point. So the exercise I'm going to show you in just a minute is one of those perspective conversations we have with churches that are wanting to launch into becoming a multi-site church. Well, Tony, at least that was our original intent. That's who we thought we would be serving. What we have found, instead of serving large monosites that want to launch into multi-site healthy, probably 70 to 80% of our churches that we've worked with are actually multi-stuck. There are about 3 locations. And so this is still a perspective exercise we'll pull out, because it helps us identify where do we give some attention so we can get our multi-site model back to a state of health. So I'm not going to go into all of them, but let me pull up the chart and walk through a few of them with you. All right. So each of these 10 areas, as we talk through them and assess them, what I would challenge you to do is to say, are we red in that area? Red alert, dashboards blinking. Are we yellow? We've got some health and some challenge. Or are we green? Like, we're not perfect, but we feel pretty healthy in that area. And a couple of them that I really want to call out. Probably one of the most important things for a multi-site church is to have clarity of DNA. Because in order to be healthy, everyone has to be on the same page about those foundational aspects of who you are as a church and those directional levels of where you're going. And that, of course, relates to our strategic alignment pyramid that many of you have seen before. But do we agree on all these things? Do we agree on our core beliefs? Most likely you do. Our mission as a church? Most likely you do. What disciples look like? Actually, most likely you do. But when we get up here and we start to talk about where are we going as a church? What do we look like in the next 3 to 5 years? What does success look like? And then this one here, the very important, how we do ministry, right? How we reach people, how we disciple people. You just need to have alignment organizationally with your key leaders. And we have this DNA. This is where we want to go. And so we ask that question up front with clarity of DNA. Are we all aligned? Are we really all aligned? Are our staff speaking from it? Are we leading from it? Has everyone got the same language and heartbeat? So that's an important one. Another important one is probably on this volunteer strength. This comes up a lot. It takes a deep bench to run multi-site churches. And depending on how large or small your sites are, volunteers are some of the key success factors to being able to lead a healthy ministry. So in number 6 here on volunteer strength, things that we ask about that is, do we have a high level of involvement of volunteer teams? And do we have this full and balanced leadership pipeline with people who are being developed over, all areas of ministry? We find that in multi-sites, we often end up overstaffing because we need people to do the ministry. But this is often, Tony, don't you agree, the core issue that we haven't quite built up our volunteer bench and sent enough people with that campus pastor to actually launch it. So this is just a great assessment to have a healthy conversation around these 10 different areas. Are we red, green, yellow? And just show you an example of one of the church. Tony, I think you and I both work with this church. You could see where they were at is they had some challenges around the people side, those 2 areas we just said. And so this was actually a church we worked with before they launched. You can see where they had a priority focus in the 12 to 18 months leading up to launch to be able to get healthier in their volunteer base, and also raising the staff leadership levels, moving people from doing ministry to leading people who lead ministry.
Yeah, and Amy, seeing that chart, it's one of the reasons why when, again, we go through the multi-site process with teams, we actually identify how many leaders is this going to take to pull off? How many volunteers are we going to need in all these different ministry teams? Because I think oftentimes, especially the larger churches, we think, well, we can just hire to get that done.
That's right.
And that's how multi-site campuses often become overstaffed because we're not thinking ahead of time, how many lay leaders, how many volunteer leaders and volunteers do we need to pull off ministries in all these core areas?
And we actually know how to define those numbers. So it's a clear goal. It's a clear target that's going to set you up for success. Yep.
That's good. Well, Tony, that's a really good way to kind of assess what might be broken right now. What's another way to commit to fixing a broken multi-site strategy?
Yeah, so I think also trying to fix our structure around multi-site is key. And Amy, I should have had you talk about this because you're really our multi-site structure expert. So feel free to jump in as I'm talking about this. But there's a couple of key principles that we need to consider when it comes to multi-site structure. One of them is just the fact that once we move from one location to 2 locations, Maybe not as much of an issue, but certainly when we start to add the third, fourth, fifth location, we are forced to move into a matrix structure. And what that essentially means is whether we want it or not, for multi-site to be successful, there needs to be somebody that has authority and leadership and on our team, and there needs to be someone who's continuing to provide influence and coaching in all of our core ministry areas. And so we need to create a matrix structure, but we need to know who has the authority and who has influence in the structure. And what we've learned in working with more than 100 churches through the years is there's one right answer to that question. So the authority, let me write it this way. Let's see here. Let's do this. The authority flows through the campus pastors at each of the location. If there's a boss, it's that person. Everybody at that campus on that team, whether it's staff or volunteers, it's the campus pastor that really is their leader. That's the person that every day they're trying to make happy. But at the same time, there are ministry leaders that are providing influence. And if you think about it, it looks like this. Influence flows this direction. And so whether that's somebody in our worship area, our next gen area, our groups area, and on and on and on, we're going to have people in our church, leaders in our church, that are thinking about all of those core ministry strategies and how we engage worship at every location, how we do groups at every location. And we want leaders like that keeping us aligned, that are providing that level of influence to all the worship leaders, all the group leaders, and all those folks that are serving at the different locations of the church. Now, what we see sometimes, either these roles aren't clarified. We've even seen churches try to flip these roles, and they've tried to make central leaders give them authority at all the locations. It would be kind of like if we were running Chick-fil-A's, the cooks at each of the location would have somebody back in Atlanta telling them how to cook the chicken. But we've actually seen churches try to do this where they have somebody centrally that's, as an example, in the groups ministry area, trying to oversee groups at every location rather than that leadership coming through the campus pastor. And every time we've seen churches try to do that, it just ends up leading to confusion. And especially for the campus pastor, they're asking the question, why am I here if I don't have the opportunity to actually build and then lead the team that's trying to accomplish ministry in our location? So that's a picture of the structure work that needs to be done. And again, sometimes we can get away with continuing the structure as if the second location is just kind of a department within the single location church's structure. But when we get to that third, fourth, fifth location, we have to figure out what the right matrix structure looks like for our church. And needless to say, unfortunately, every structure for every church looks a little bit different. And that's why when we engage with churches around multi-site strategy, we also include a way to look at kind of staffing and structure to make sure we're customizing that structure to fit your multi-site strategy. And I will tell you, it looks a little bit different for every church we serve. And Amy, again, you're kind of the expert when it comes to multi-site structure. Anything you would add before we move on?
I actually do. I'm just sure it's showing up in the Q&A right now. Let's use your group. Your central groups person. What Tony is saying is you don't want your central groups person responsible for the groups people at every campus. What you do want your central groups person, where they do have decision rights, is on the ministry strategy you've chosen to get people into groups. The difference is it's now the campus pastor's responsibility to make sure his or her campus is leveraging that strategy to get people into groups. And if they are successful or not, it's that campus pastor's, he or she has the authority to oversee that. That's a difference. So your central leaders do have decision rights. They do have some authority. But when it comes to the execution of those ministry strategies, it's the campus pastor's responsibility to oversee and select those team members.
I think that's great addition. And so central leaders, they're oftentimes shaping the strategy, but then the campus leaders are the ones that are actually executing that strategy to make it, they're making it happen. Is that right?
That's right. That's right. Yep.
Yeah.
Yet the one exception can be worship. I have still probably seen more centrally designed and led worship teams where they fall under the authority of the campus pastor on the weekend, but not during the week. But we won't muddy those waters here.
Tony, I want to move on to the next section, but any other final thoughts on fixing broken strategies before we go there?
Yeah, we talked a lot about this earlier in our conversation today, but needless to say, you got to figure out the teaching delivery if multi-site's going to work. And Amy and I, again, because of all of the success we've seen with churches that have moved in this direction, and then the opposite effect for churches that haven't, we are firm believers in one voice at all the locations on any given Sunday. And so primarily using video delivery to make sure everybody's hearing the same message every week. Now, does that mean you shouldn't have a teaching team? Absolutely not. We are also strong advocates for every church having a team of teachers that's communicating, teaching, preaching at every location. We would just encourage you to think about that teaching team providing the teaching on any given Sunday through video so that the whole church gets to experience all of those voices as well. And frankly, it's a great way for every one of your locations to not only experience a diversity of perspective and experience, but I think it's a good thing in the end for the people of God to recognize it's not just one person that can teach God's word. We can hear from God through a number of different teaching voices.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we move on to the next section, for those of you, again, tuning in, take just a moment to reflect after this part of the conversation. And based off of the multi-site assessments checkpoints that we shared earlier, what's one area and those that you know immediately you would not mark as green? What's one area that you know right away you would not mark as green? Okay, now let's move into the last conversation before we get to the Q&A. We've helped a number of churches actually un-multisite over the last few years when it really was the best decision for them. It was the right thing to do. But how do you decide if that's your church's next step? Let's talk about that for a bit. So, Tony, will you show us that multi-site spectrums chart again and just kind of walk us through what would indicate un-multisiting is just the best course of action for a church?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go back to the chart. In fact, one of the churches I mentioned earlier that where everything was leaning independent, they went through a process of, I think they kind of split off one location. It became an independent church and they shut down another location. That's one example, but we've probably worked with dozens of churches that found themselves in this place where they, over time, had created a lot of independence with their multi-site campuses and recognized we need to move in a different direction. And so bottom line is if you go through this conversation with your team and you're all feeling like, well, it needs to be independent in all of these ministry strategies, that should trigger in your minds a recognition we should be going towards independence as campuses, as churches too. In other words, we should maybe begin to treat these campuses as future church plants or figure out a way that we can help them become independent churches. And we did this. Even in the last 12 months, we worked with a great church, large church, and they had, I think it was 2 or 3 multi-site locations. Coming into COVID, though, they recognized we're seeing a lot of momentum and are foreseeing a bigger impact that could be made through our online ministry. And we've just never seen that kind of traction around people connecting with our church and our ministry through our multi-site strategy. And so they went through a process to shut down their other locations and really reinvest all of those resources and that leadership into their online strategy, and already starting to see some reward from that. And it's just a good example of, we're still called to be stewards of the resources that God's providing for us. And when we're investing in strategies and we're not seeing kingdom return, I hope that in our minds is raising the question, should we continue to do this? Or is there a better way for us to be investing these resources so we can be making a greater kingdom impact? And this church, as I mentioned, is starting to see that now that they're investing in their online ministry. Sean, a number of years ago, I was working with a church and we were just struggling it was our Saturday evening service to get any kind of momentum. And as a result of that, it felt like we were going backwards. But we decided to end our Saturday evening service and instead encourage all those folks to come to one of the two services on Sunday morning. And it was interesting. As soon as we did that, as you can imagine, those Sunday services felt fuller. It felt like there was more energy in the room. People felt like, more people showed up. And it's interesting, that prompted folks to start to invite their friends again because we hadn't seen that in a while. And by reducing the number of services, the church actually started to grow. And we've seen that happen when it comes to multi-site as well. We've seen churches that have reduced their number of campuses, but by kind of regaining alignment and pulling together again and pulling all the resources together, they've started to see momentum again, and they've actually experienced growth, even though they've reduced the number of campuses that they have. And so, I think the big question is, are we seeing a return on the kingdom investment that we're making? And if not, that's an indication we may need to un-multisite. And fortunately, if you're needing help with that, we've worked with a number of churches as they've gone through that un-multisiting process.
Amy, what about you? What are some other reasons that you've counseled churches to un-multisite?
Yeah, there's probably three big reasons I would encourage a church to un-multisite. One of them is just that they have different mission fields around their different locations. If those are truly distinct mission fields, it's going to be very hard to stay together as one multi-site church. In fact, one church I'm working with right now, they're just wrestling with this. The sending location is in a community with a very distinct demographic, and a couple of their sites have very, very different demographics. Tony, I remember a coaching network we did years ago, and one of the churches there was like, they really felt called to multi-site. It was a Wisconsin church, if I remember. But they admitted like who we are as a church and where we want to go. That's a college town. That's something like this. And I just remember we said, you know what, plant it. Find a way to send it out for 3-4 years, help them out. But don't try to be one church, multiple locations if you truly have different mission fields. So that's a great reason to un-multisite if you feel you're actually better apart than better together. Another reason would be that you're just too small to all thrive together. So you mentioned it early, Tony, about how we help people build out, how many attenders do we need? How many volunteers, how many volunteer leaders, how many staff? What I find with some unhealthy multi-site churches is that we've launched small campuses and we weren't that big to begin with. And by the way, I know a church of 100 or 200 is a big church when we look at average numbers, but we recommend that churches don't multi-site until they're at least 1,000 people, because we want you to send at least 100 people to your new campus, because that means you'll probably open with 200 people. And now you can actually hire a campus pastor, someone in the music area, and a kids pastor who can build up that body and become a solid church. We find when you're smaller, everyone's spread just a little bit thinner, almost too thin, right? And to use Jim Tomberlin's analogy, it's like having a new baby. A new campus is like a new baby, and bigger babies eat better, sleep better, and they thrive sooner. And so bigger is better when it comes to launches. But I would counsel a church that has too many small locations to revisit how can we make a couple of those healthy, maybe by combining, but then releasing them or un-multi-siting so that they can grow. And then the last area is really going back to where we started, is on the teaching. If you've been using live teaching, kind of independent teachers for the life of your multi-site or for a significant length of time, it's going to be very hard to pull that back to a video teaching, or it's just going to be more painful than you hope. So if you are really a church committed to live teaching in every location, I would just, again, call it what it is. you're going to move towards independent campuses, or you're going to be a really frustrated, stuck multi-site church. So start the road to going, how can we really celebrate, get those locations to a place of health and launch them? And then if you want to ever be one church, multiple locations, start the teaching just a little bit, just a lot of it different.
So in just a minute, we're going to move on to live Q&A. But Tony, any final thoughts that you have about this topic before we wrap up?
Yeah, specific to unmultisiting. This is going to be a little bit of vulnerability here. I had a great idea a couple of years ago, and we implemented it. And initially, and I'm talking about the Unstuck Group, initially it helped a lot of churches, it helped a lot of pastors. And then I think related to COVID, we started to lose momentum in the last number of months. And it was about 3 months ago, I think the rest of my team saw it on my face. I was recognizing, and they were too, this is not getting the return on investment that we originally made. And it was tough because I knew they were all looking to me to make the final call. We need to stop doing this. And I was feeling like I've asked my team to invest all this time. We've invested a lot of money, time and money to do this. And this was my idea, but the team's looking for me to make this decision. And it was tough, but together they walked me through it. We agreed we need to push pause on this so we can reinvest that time and energy in other ways that are having a bigger impact now in this season. So all that to say, I get it. I've been in your shoes, and I think some of you may be feeling this, that we've invested a lot of time, a lot of financial resources, but we're not getting the kingdom return that we thought we were going to get with Multisite. Don't let that be a hindrance to being a good steward going forward of the resources that God's given your church. And again, we've worked with a couple of churches in the last number of months. I'm thinking specifically of a church in Florida. They unmultisited. I just connected with the pastor in the last few weeks. They're growing like gangbusters again. I think it was just bringing all of that resources and kind of regaining alignment as a ministry, and they're starting to see momentum again. There was actually a very big church in the Midwest. At their original location, they had several thousands of people and launched 2 other locations. And those other locations combined, those 2 new locations had more than 1,500 people. So, I mean, most of us would look at that and say, that's success. But honestly, the senior pastor just didn't feel like he wanted to lead a multi-site church. And so we worked with them over the last year to unmultisite and help those churches become independent ministries. And so I guess the bottom line here is I don't want you to see this as a failure. Number one, I think it's a good thing when we try to make some bold moves to accomplish the mission that God's given us. And at the same time, we know we're taking a bit of a risk, but that's good. If we think that risk can produce kingdom results, if we can see more people come to know Jesus and follow Jesus. But at the same time, if we make those bold moves and we don't see the return, then I think to be good stewards of the resources God's given us, we have to be willing to make that decision to unmultisite. And don't be surprised if you make that type of faith step as well. If God actually produces fruit through that, and in the end, you see some of the momentum that we've described in the churches that have made that decision.
So before we move on to the live Q&A, again, for those of you tuning in, just take just a moment, reflect, use your conversation guide. This really is a stewardship decision based on our time, financial, and leadership investment. What's your gut level response to this? Should you continue with a multi-site strategy? Take just a second, reflect on that, and then we're going into live Q&A. All right, so Tony, a lot of great questions coming in the Q&A so far in this conversation. A lot of conversation going on in the chat. So I'm anxious to get into this, and we will in just a second. But before we do, just a few next steps for you to know about as we wrap up today's conversation. I saw a few questions about this in the chat as well. We're going to email a link to all the resources that we talked about today, as well as just the video, so that you can watch this again if you'd like to. We're going to email that out all by tomorrow afternoon. So if you're looking for the resources, the video, you'll have all of that in your email by tomorrow afternoon. Remember, our goal for this webinar is that you're going to commit today to fixing your multi-site strategy sometime this year, or to unmultisiting. So hopefully we've given you some of the tools to be able to do that. But I know that many of you, and based on what I've seen in the questions here, you've got some looking for some clarity about your next step specifically in your local context there. So we would love to be able to help with that. And you can reach out to us. Just connect with us at the unstuckgroup.com. You'll get an opportunity to talk to myself, or maybe get a chance to talk to Tony. We'd love to be able to help you take your next step in your local context. And if you have questions that maybe we don't get to today, feel free to reach out. We can talk through those as well. All right. So Tony, you ready for some questions?
Well, yeah, I so many questions, Sean. I think we finally hit a topic that people are really interested, for one thing, but also Absolutely. I think we're going to try to answer as many as we can now, but we'll certainly try to provide answers to all the questions that came in through our content in the coming days too. But yeah, lots of good questions here.
All right, here we go. So Jordan's helped us kind of set up our questions. We've got several here. We'll see how many we can get to in the time remaining. But question number one, what's the first step in unmultisiting? What are some of the best practices, important elements that we should consider when we're moving a campus to become independent?
Yeah, so I think it really begins with going back to some of the foundational aspects of who you are as a church, and just reconfirming again, what is our mission? What do we sense God's calling us to do going forward into the future? How do we engage people in our mission field? And kind of just reestablishing clarity around those foundational pieces of who we are as a church. And then with that, once we get that clarity and confirmation, the plan going forward either is going to help to confirm we've made the right decision to unmultisite, and then the plan will start to almost create itself for what that unmultisiting needs to look like. Or you're going to start to realize, well, wait a second, now that we have clarity again on who we are, what God's trying to accomplish, who we're trying to reach in our mission field, multi-site, it wasn't the problem. We just weren't engaging multi-site in a way that was most effectively helping us accomplish our mission. Yeah. Now, specifics about how to multi-site, frankly, that's going to look different for every church. And we've seen it with the dozens of churches we've helped on multi-site. We really have to help every church create a customized strategy, because, you know, the scope of these, the size of these campuses look a little bit different. The amount of staffing involved looks a little bit different. The financial ramifications look a little bit different. So in order to really give any guidance related to what those first steps should look like, if you've made the decision we're going to unmulti-site, you almost need somebody to come in and really coach you through that.
Yeah. And Tony, you started this, I think, the right way. We've seen so many churches who've reached out thinking that's the right next step. And then as they dig into it, they just realize, you know what, our multi-site strategy is just broken in some places. And when we address that, it seems like things are functioning so much better, and there's health on the other side of that. So, yeah,
a good example of that is the church I referenced in the webinar today. That they were all on that independent side of the chart, and things weren't working. And yes, they did close a couple of their campuses, but they're still in 3 locations. And now that they've fixed their multi-site strategy, they're seeing growth and momentum again. So yeah, it may just be that you need to revisit your multi-site strategy.
Yeah, very good. All right, question number 2. Let's say you realize you have a campus pastor who's out of alignment and does want to preach. They lean more on that independent than identical. What's the best way to help kind of transition that campus pastor without damaging the health of the campus itself?
Yeah, well, I think it begins by you clarifying what does success look like in that leadership role as a campus pastor? What are the wins? And really clarifying what that role needs to look like, and then sitting down with your campus pastor and just expressing this is what we're looking for. This is what the job's all about, and hopefully hearing from them, yeah, I'm interested in that. Give me some coaching so that I can fulfill that role. I think a lot of times the reason why there's a bit of a disconnect and tension with campus pastors is we've never defined the win up front, and we haven't done a good job of clarifying what that leadership role looks like. Now, it might be by clarifying the role, that campus pastor recognizes, oh, if that's what you're looking for, that's not my giftedness. That's not my wiring. I may not be a fit for this role. And that can then begin a helpful conversation about how you can help them take a next step into a role that will be a better fit for their giftedness. And transitions happen all the time in churches. We shared several months ago that in business world, there's about a 15% turnover in staffing year after year in business organizations. And we should be expecting that in churches as well. There should be about a 15% turnover in our staffing in our churches. And as a result of that, maybe we just need to figure out we have good onboarding solutions to help our staff engage in our culture and our strategies, and onboarding them into the context of the broader church within your congregation. Maybe it just means we need to also define some clear offboarding strategies as staff team roll off our team too, just to make sure that they're treated well in their departure, but the congregation understands just kind of the normal nature. This is normal life. People come and serve for a while, and then they move on to what God has next for them in their ministry and their life.
Yep. And one of the hallmarks of a growing church is there's going to be constant change happening, right? That just happens as we grow, and we should be used to that at some point.
That's right.
Are there any differences that you've seen between multi-site churches in city suburban areas versus small town or more rural areas? Or do the principles that we've talked about, do they apply kind of across the board for multi-site churches, even if churches are vastly different sizes?
Yeah, the principles are certainly the same. And I mentioned in the chat, I know some of you aren't watching the chat stream, but remember too, the principles aren't absolutes. Will you find exceptions to some of the principles we talked about? Absolutely. However, what we've seen over time after working with more than 100 churches through the years, when it comes to multi-site strategy, there's certainly some common distinctions between churches that embrace the principles we talked about today and the results that they're getting in their multi-site strategy. And so as a result of that, I think we do have opportunities to really make sure, are we approaching our strategy following those principles, and the context doesn't matter as much as long as we're getting to the principles. And because of that, the execution, it will look a little bit different in an urban context compared to a rural context. But the key is to make sure we're kind of leaning into those principles that we talked about today.
Yeah. And if you are a multi-site church in a more rural setting, we've worked with several multi-site churches who are very, very rural. One of our teammates, Jesse, leads at a great multi-site church that's very rural in the Iowa area, and he served a lot of those churches as well. So if you're a rural multi-site church looking for help with, how do we build health in what we're doing, reach out to us, because we have some experience there that I think we can be helpful with.
Yeah, I think they're up to 6 locations. I could be wrong.
I think that's right.
All in small communities within Iowa, but yet they're reaching several thousand people. And Jesse has seen all these principles too, and he would endorse the fact that what we're talking about today still works in rural churches.
Yeah, that's great. Tony, what guidance do you have for churches that are grappling with that transition from live teaching to video teaching? So they're live teaching now, trying to move to video teaching. And if we have congregants who are saying, now I feel disconnected for some reason because of that shift.
Well, I'm assuming, one of the quick answers to that is, and I mentioned this in chat, if you do give people a choice, would you rather listen to a video teacher or a live teacher? every person is going to say, I'd rather listen to live. So first thing is, don't survey your congregation about that decision. But the reality is, it is a lot easier if you start multi-site with video teaching. Mm-hmm. And then if you find that doesn't work, to switch to live teaching. I wouldn't recommend that, but it's a lot easier to make that transition than it is to start with live teaching and go back and then go to video at that point. However, we've seen churches do it. And I think one of the things we need to remember is if a live teacher is the thing that someone says they need to have, that live teaching is going to be happening someplace. And so that option is still available. If that's kind of the draw the red line in the sand, if I can't see a live teacher, then I'm not going to be connected to this church. Well, the good news is, even if you use video teaching for delivery, there will be a live option that's available. One of the churches that we work with out in Arizona, it's interesting. They have from time to time moved that live teaching, though, that's being delivered to all the other locations, to some of their newer campuses. And some of their existing campuses are receiving the video teaching, while their newer ones are seeing the live teaching. And that may not be such a bad strategy as you're bringing new campuses on, to maybe think about, maybe this becomes, at least for a season, the live teaching venue. But in the long run, again, are there churches that are making live teaching work? Yeah, I can name some examples of that. We talked about one in our podcast episode recently. But for the most part, when you look at this question across all these multi-site churches we've worked with, live teaching is it's hard to scale to beyond just 2 or 3 locations. It gets very expensive to pay people to be teaching at all these locations. And over time, it's the voice of that campus pastor becomes just a little bit disconnected from the voice of the senior pastor of the church. And no one intentionally tries to create division in the church. But over time, unfortunately, that seems to be the tendency we see time and time again. Yeah.
And however you do video teaching, you need to do it well. I think sometimes churches get sticker shock when they see the cost of video equipment, but it's still less expensive than a live teaching strategy at every location. So absolutely, you got to do it well. How long should it reasonably take for a campus to become financially viable?
To where by the way, let me, before I get to that, I didn't have a chance to share this thought earlier too. If you just come to the conclusion that it needs to be live teaching at every location, that could be an indication that you need to consider church planting model as well. Yeah. And church planting is a great model for replicating the ministry of the local church. And so maybe you just need to lean into that strategy rather than trying to force a strategy on multi-site.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sorry, Sean, I cut you off.
No, that's okay. That's great. We would advocate for church planting, right? Absolutely. It's just a different strategy than multi-site, but both are needed. So, my question was, how long should it reasonably take for a campus to become financially viable, to where they're paying for their own campus, own programming? What's the best way to fund a multi-site campus?
Yeah, again, that's kind of a challenging question, Sean, because it's going to be different in every situation. And I've seen in some instances churches open a campus and immediately it's self-sustaining financially. And then in other instances, it may take multiple years before that location becomes self-sustaining. And then frankly, it's my hope for some multi-site churches that you will open locations that may never be financially sustaining because of the type of community that you're moving into that may not have the economic support that some of your locations might have. Now, with that, let me share this caution. Because we've seen churches, it's a heart for bringing the gospel, the good news, to people that maybe don't have the financial resources that some others in our community have. If that's your very first campus, it's going to be very challenging for you to financially resource that new location. And what I've encourage churches to do is think a little bit more longer term about our multi-site strategy, knowing eventually we want a location there, and you might identify this could be location number 3, 4, or 5 as an example. But we need to start with some locations that we know will be financially sustainable, so that we're in a better position to go into the community, which will never pay for itself.
Yeah, absolutely. That's good. Well, Tony, we're out of time for today. Unfortunately, this has been a really fun conversation. And there are a lot of questions that we got today that we weren't able to get to. So we're going to try to answer those in some of our follow-up content. And if you have questions that just didn't get answered today and you'd like to talk with us about it, just reach out to us. You can go to the unstuckgroup.com and start a conversation with us. Myself, possibly even Tony, would love to have that conversation with you and kind of help you figure out some next steps for yourself specifically. So remember, we'll be sending out information tomorrow, all the resources and the video that went with today's conversation. We appreciate you joining us, and we'll see you again in a future webinar. Have a good afternoon.